Including Michael?
We have a motion to complete like 18 of the yard.
We'll go on, and your dog will probably go. And that's how it was.
That's the middle of the night.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome. Let's begin, as we do, with Matovu on page 61 or page 2. Matovu, oh halecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael. Matovu, oh halecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael. So welcome everybody, Shabbat Shalom. We are blessed with a very beautiful morning before what I hope will not end up being a stormy time here. But it's a reminder and a really easy way for us to sort of access what Shabbat is here to offer us, which is the sacred pause and the opportunity to really notice the beauty of the world around us, the joy of the world around us. So easy to do on a beautiful summer morning. So we spend the time this Shabbat morning really sinking into that, really enjoying that as the gift that it is in our lives. And to do that, you will not be surprised to hear me say that I want to offer a poem. Those of you who, I guess, have been here long enough know that is really what I'm going to say. And at some point, someone's going to parody me saying that, I think. It's just become the thing I say. Then it's a problem. Then it's like, what's wrong? There's no poem.
Rabbi, all right.
Yes, God forbid there's a day that poetry runs out. That will be a sad day. But so the poem that I want to offer this morning is a poem called Fresh Delights by Alden Solovey. Life is a garden of fresh delights, blossoming with wonders large and small. The first bird of the morning, the fresh smells of dawn, and the promise of awe and adventure. Holy One, help me to see, to love, and to cherish this harvest, this bounty of gifts, this flow of sights. Let me feel the rushing river pulsing in my veins. Let me know the sacred sunshine in my beating heart. Let me thank you and bless you, God of old, for your steadfast love day by day. Life is a garden of fresh delights, blossoming with praises for your holy name. This brings us right into our prayers for gratitude this morning, our first opportunity to notice this beauty. So we'll continue, and I'll invite Steve up to join me here on our bima. We're on page 63 or page 9 in English.
The soul that you, my God, have given me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. You keep body and soul together. One day you will take my soul from me to restore it to me in life eternal. So long as this soul is within me, I acknowledge you, Adonai, my God, my ancestors' God, Master of all creation, Sovereign of all souls. Praise to you, Adonai, who restores the soul to the lifeless, exhausted body. I hereby accept the obligation of fulfilling my Creator's mitzvah in the Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself.
I'll invite us all to rise in body or in spirit for Birchot HaShachar, for our blessings for daily miracles. We find that on page 65 or page 10.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lasech livina lavchin ben yom uben laila.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani betzalmo.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani Yisrael.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani bat chorin.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, pokeach ivrim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, malbish harumim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, zoker chafufim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, rokah haaretz al hamayim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asali kol tzorki.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamechim et tzadei gaver.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, ozer Yisrael bihura.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, oti Yisrael v'tifara.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hanoten la'yaref koach.
Amen.
You may be seated. We'll continue in English on the bottom of 65 or on page 11.
Praised are you, Adonai our God, who rules the universe, removing sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids. May we feel at home with your Torah and cling to your mitzvah. Keep us from error, from sin and transgression. Bring us not to trial or disgrace. Let no evil impulse control us. Keep us far from wicked people and corrupt companions. Strengthen our desire to do good deeds. Teach us humility that we may serve you. May we find grace, love, and compassion in your sight and in the sight of all who look upon us this day and every day. Grant us a full measure of loving kindness. Praised are you, Adonai, who bestows loving kindness upon his people Israel. ותנין היום ובכל יום וכן לחסד ורחמים בעינך ובין הכל ראינו ותגמלנו חסדים טובים ברוך אתה אדוני גומל חסדים טובים לעמו ישראל.
Amen. This brings us to our Psalm for Shabbat on page 72 or page 32.
מזמור שיר ליום השבת טוב להודות לאדוני ולזמר לשמך העליון ולזמר לשמך העליון להגיד בבוקר חסדך ואמונתך בלילות עלי עשה ועלי נבל עלי היגיון בחינות מזמור שיר ליום השבת טוב להודות לאדוני ולזמר לשמך העליון ולזמר לשמך העליון.
And we'll continue individually through the bottom of the page. And we close with the last 4 lines of the psalm, starting with the word Sadiq Katamar.
Sadiq Katamar Yefrach Yeres Bavanon Yesgeb Shitulim Beveit Adonai Bechatrot Eloheinu Yafrichu O Genuvon Besed ישני בעננים יהיו להגיד כי ישר אדוני צורי ולא עוולתו.
So since we are in the season of, well, Yashkalach Steve, thank you. So since we are in the season, beginning the season of reflection and return, we are in the month of Elul, we include Psalm 27 in our services. A psalm that is really about sort of finding the voice of hope amidst turmoil and amidst struggle. So we find that psalm on page 80 or page 41, and we're just going to sing the line that starts about 7 lines from the top and starting with the words Achat Sha'alti. Exactly. Achat Sha'alti me'et Adonai ota avakesh. Achat Sha'alti me'et Adonai ota avakesh. Shifti bevet Adonai kol yemei chayai. Lachazot benoam Adonai ulevaker b'chalo. Lachazot benoam Adonai ulevaker b'chalo. This brings us to the first mourner's Kaddish of our service, which we find on page 82 or page 52. I'll invite you to rise in body or in spirit if you're in mourning or commemorating a Yortzeit this Shabbat. Yitgadal ve'yitkadash shemei Rabbah ve'alma divra kirtei ve'amlich malchutei ve'chayechon v'yomechon u'chayei dechol beit Yisrael v'agala u'vizman kari ve'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mehurach le'olam u'almei al-mayam. Yitbarach ve'yishtabach ve'yitpa'ar ve'yitramam ve'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushvechata v'nechemata ta'miran be'alma ve'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya ve'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. So this brings us to Psukei de Zimra, moving from gratitude to our verses, to our songs of joy and of praise this Shabbat. I'd like to invite everybody to rise in body or in spirit, and I'd love to invite Michael and Marianne to join me up on the bima to begin leading us in Baruch She'amar.
Baruch She'amar v'chaya ha'olam. Baruch Hu, Baruch Oseh Bereshit. Baruch Omer v'Yosef. Baruch Ozer u'Mekayim. Baruch Merachem al ha'aretz. Baruch Merachem al ha'briot. Baruch Meshalem Sakarto B'Reav. Baruch Ha'ad V'Kayam L'Netzach. Baruch Bodeh U'Mafsil. Baruch Shema.
Then we continue individually with the next paragraph.
Yachidei ha'olamim
Melech Meshubach Umfor Adei Ad Shemo Agadol Baruch Atah Adonai Melech Mechubah V'Tishbecho.
Amen. Amen. You may be seated. So, Michael and Marianne, you are oh no, you're done here. You're done here. Okay. Well, Yasher Koach. So let's continue now with the Ashrei on page 96 or page 80, and I'll invite Steve back up here to lead us.
Ashrei Ushrei Beitecha Yehalalucha Selah.
Ashrei Ham Shetachalo, Ashrei Ham Shadonai Eloham.
Tila LeDavid Aramim Elohai HaMelech V'Avochashim Echal Yolam Vayed.
V'chol Yom Avarchaka, V'levashim Chal Yolam Vayed.
Gadol Adonai Mohamod V'Ligdolato Ein Chekeh.
Dor Ledor Shavach Maasecha, V'Gvuratecha Yagidu.
Adak Kavod Hodecha V'Divrei Niflotecha Asicha.
Ve'ezul Noratecha Yomeru, U'Tulatecha Saprana.
Zecher Rav Tuvacha Yabiu V'Tzikatecha Yamanenu.
Chanu L'Rakum Adonai, Erech Lapayim U'Gal Chasen.
Tov Adonai L'Kohol V'Racham Aval Kol Ma'asav.
Yovaducha Adonai Kol Ma'asecha, V'Chasidecha Yevarchucha.
Kavod Malchutecha Yomeru Gvuratecha Yadaberu.
Lehodia Livnei Hadam Gurotav, V'Chvod Hadar Malchuto.
Malchutecha Malchut Kol Olamim U'Memshatecha B'Chol Dor V'Dor.
Somech Adonai L'Chol HaNoflim, V'Zokach L'Chol HaKfufim.
Einei Chol Elecha Yisaberu V'Ata Noten Lahem Et Achlam B'Ito.
Hotel Et Yadecha, U'Maspia L'Chol Chai Ratzon.
Tzadik Adonai B'Chol Deracha V'Chasid B'Chol Ma'asav.
Tarov Adonai L'Chol Korav, L'Chol Asher Yikra'u Be'emet.
V'Tzon Yirov Ya'aseh V'Yet Shabbatam Yishma V'Yoshiyim.
Shomer Adonai Kol Avav, Ve'et Kol Rasha'im Yashmin.
Tehillat Adonai Yadaber Pi V'Varech Chol Basor Shem Kachol Yolam Vayed.
V'anachnu Nevarech Yah, Me'atav Yadolam. Hallelujah. Talk, Steve. So we'll continue on page 100 or page 88 with Hallelujah. 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 done a journey from gratitude through praise, and we here at TBT end that journey with the words Kol HaNeshama Tehallel, hallelujah, which is describing the entirety of our soul being present. Kol HaNeshama, as I have said in the past, can either mean every soul, every one of us and our souls. It can also mean the entirety of our soul. The hope of the journey till this moment is that we have awakened the entirety of our souls to begin sort of being in the world and being in the joys and abundance of the world in a new way. So in our soul's entirety, we continue with shacharit, and we continue with bringing together the entirety of all of our souls to praise Adonai, to praise the divine that we experience in the world around us. So we begin that coming together on page 104 or page 335 in English. The breath of all that lives praises you, Adonai, our God. The force that drives all flesh exalts you, our sovereign always. Transcending space and time, you are God. Without you, we have no one to rescue and redeem us, to save and sustain us, to show us mercy in disaster and distress. Ruler of all ages, God of all creatures, endlessly extolled. You guide the world with kindness, its creatures with compassion. Adonai, who neither slumbers nor sleeps, you stir the sleeping, give voice to the speechless, free the fettered, support the falling, and raise those bowed down. You alone do we acknowledge. Let's pick up in Hebrew at the box and the word Nehalelcha on page 105 or 336. Nehalelcha, Neshabecha, Nevarecha, Unevarech Hashem Kodecha Kamor LeDavid, Baruchi Nafshi et Adonai, V'chol Karavai et Shem Kodsho, Shochenad Marum V'kadosh Shemo, V'chaturan Tzadikim Adonai V'yesharim Hava Tehillah, V'fi Yesharim Titala, U'v'divrei Tzadikim Titbarach, U'b'elshon Chasidim Titromam, U'v'kerev Kadoshim Titkadash, U'makalot Revivot Amecha Beit Yisrael, Verina Yitarshim Hamalkeinu L'chol Devador, Sheken Chovat Kol Yetzurim, Lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu, Lehodot Lehamel, Leshabech Lefaer, Leromem Lehadeh, Lemarech Lalel Kales, Al Kol Divrei Shirat V'Tishbechot, David ben Yishai, Avdecha Meshichecha. We continue on the top of 106, or we are on 338. Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu Ala Melech Gadol V'Gelach V'Shema La'arach Shulchan Eloheinu V'Shem Shir Shpacha Halel V'Zimra V'Natan Yosef Edula Gvura Tila V'Tiber Kesha Malchut Brachot V'Hodaot Me'atzalei Adolam Baruch Atah Adonai El Melech Gadol V'Tishbachot El Avodot Adon HaNiflaot Avocher B'Shirei Zimra Melech Elchei HaOlamim. And I invite you to rise in body or in spirit. Yitgadal v'yitkadosh Shemei Rabbah Ve'alma divrach yirteh v'yamlich malchuteh V'chayechon v'yom echon v'chayeh dechol Beit Yisrael V'gala u'bizman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach Ve'olam amei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar v'yitshoma v'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yitala v'yitalal Shmei v'kudasha b'richu Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata V'shbechata v'nechemata Damiran be'alma v'imru Amen. We remain standing in body or in spirit for the Barchu, which we find on page 107 or 340. I'd love to invite you to join me in taking a deep breath together, a deep breath in and out. Help us really be here. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai Borach Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Yotzer Or V'Orech Hoshech Oseh Shalom Urayat HaKol. You may be seated. We are on page 110 or 344. Titbarach Turinu Malkeinu V'Goaleinu V'Zedashim Yisnafshim Chazan Malkeinu V'Tzerem Shamta V'Shemashar Kulam V'Dim V'Rum Allah Mashim B'Yer Yachem Chali B'Elin Chayim Melech Olam Kulam Ahuvim Kulam Berurim Kulam Giborim V'Kulam Osim V'Mavir Aritzon Konam V'Kulam Podchim V'Piham V'Tu Sha'otara V'Shirov Zimra U'Mevarachim U'Meshavachim U'Farim U'Maritzim U'Mafkishim U'Mamlichim Et Shem Ha'el HaMelech HaGadol HaGibor VeHaRak HaDoshu V'Chulam Mekavlim Alehem O Malchut Shamayim Zemizah V'Nonim Reshut Zeh Lazeh V'Akdish Le'otam B'Nachad Ruach V'Safa V'Rav Neima Kedosh HaKulam Kechad Onim Ve'omrim Ve'yira Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzevaot Melech Kol Ha'aretz Kevodo V'Ha'ofanim V'Chayot HaKodesh V'Erash Gadol Minaseim L'umat Serafim V'Yumatam Meshavachim Ve'omrim Baruch Yavod Adonai Mimkomo Le'el Baruch Nemo Titeinu L'Melech HaChadet Hayam Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir 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 V'nizkar Kulanu Meheira Le'oro V'nizkar Kulanu Meheira Le'oro Baruch Atah Adonai Yotzer HaMeorot. So I'll invite you as we begin Ahavat Rabbah, the first of our prayers that's about putting love at the center, to bring together the four corners of your talit, whether it is a physical talit, a more spiritual talit, as an act of awareness, an act of beginning to notice the wholeness that is ultimately the truest reality within ourselves. We do that as a way to receive Ahavah Rabbah, as a way to receive the abundant love that God is sending to us all the time, that is helping us and sustaining us. We are on the top of 111 or on 346. Ahavah Rabbah, Ahavtanu Adonai Eloheinu, Chama Gadol Avitecha, Chama Tavlinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avolatim, Shmatulecha, Talmudem Kulkechaim, Ken, Tochanim, Something Avinu, Avarachma, Rachem, Rachem, Avinu, Tegaleinu, Vahavinu, Hafshu, Yishmael, Yavlo, Yavlo, Samkim, Chaviv, Tamutra, Tachadei Hava. V'ha'ereneinu b'toratecha, v'dadek libeinu b'mitzotecha, v'yachel levaveinu, v'yahava u'yira et shemecha, v'lo Tehila v'nismecha b'shuatecha v'harienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot haaretz v'tolichenu komemiut le'artzenu ki elko yeshuatata ubanu v'charta mikolam v'lashon v'keratanu l'shimcha hagadol sela sela ve'emet lehodot lecha uyachencha be'ahava Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'amo Yisrael be'ahava. Continue with the Shema on the top of 112. We're on 346. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levacha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi metzalecha hayom al levavecha v'shinatam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shitecha b'reitecha u'lachtecha b'derech u'v'shoftecha l'kumecha u'shartam layot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha u'chtabtam al mezuzot beitecha u'b'sharecha. We'll continue with the second paragraph of the Shema individually. We are on the top of 113, or on page 348 for the third paragraph of the Shema. Vahayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael ve'amarta alehem ve'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei v'itehem ladorotam ve'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf patil techelet v'alachem letzitzit uritem oto uzchartem et kol mitzvot Adonai v'asitem otam ve'lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei nechem asher atem zonim achareihem le'man tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'hitem kedoshim l'Elohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem le'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem Adonai Elohechem emet. We'll continue with the word emet ve'asim emet ve'asim לדור ודור הוא קיים, ושמו קיים בחיסו נכון, ומלכותו ומועצו לעד קיימת, ודבריו חיים וקיימים. אני נכנסים לעד ומעולמים, ובכן ומעבדת, וכן אפילו פסות. אמת שאתה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו Malkeinu melech avotenu, Go'aleinu Go'el avotenu, Yotzreinu to Yeshuateinu, Vodeinu Matzilenu me'olam shemecha, Ein Elohim zulatecha. We are on the top of 114 or on 350. Ezra Tavotenu Atahu Me'olam Mogenu Shemim Ha'achim B'chol Zervatzon Nim'om HaShagav Teilad Le'Elyon Baruch Umorach Moshe Uvnei Yisrael Echad Neshira Besimcha Rabah Ve'amru Kulam Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai Mi Chamocha Netar B'Kodesh Norah Teilot Osefet Shira Chadasha Shilchu Gelim L'Shimcha Al Sefat Hayom Yachad Kulam Hodu Ve'imlichu Ve'amru Adonai Imloch Le'olam Va'ed. Nice, all to rise in body or in spirit. To Yisrael, Kuma Be'ezrat Yisrael, Uvtechinu Mecha, Yehuda Be'Yisrael, Go Aleinu Adonai Tzvaot Shema, Kedosh Yisrael, Baruch Atah Adonai, Ga'al Yisrael. We remain standing in body or in spirit for the Amidah, which we find on page 115b or on the back cover of your Siddur. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avotenu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim Ve'konei Hakol Ve'zocher Chasdei Avot U'mevi Goel Livnei V'neihem Leman Shemo Ve'ahava Melech Ozer Ufoked U'Moshia U'Magen Baruch Atah Adonai Magen Avraham Ufoked Sarah Atah Yibor Le'olam Adonai Mechayei Meitim Atah Rav Lehoshia Mechalkel Chaim B'Chesed Mechayei Meitim B'Rachamim Rabim Somech Noflim B'Rofei Cholim U'Matir Asurim U'Mekayem Emunato L'Shenei Yafat Michamocha Ba'al Gevurot U'Midon Melech Menid U'Mechayeh U'Masmiach Yeshua Leman Atah L'Chayot Meitim Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayei HaMeitim. We continue at the top of 116 or 356. Nekadesh et Shimcha ba'olam, Keshem shemati shemoto b'shmei marom, Kach etziva yad neviyecha, Ve'kara zeh el zeh, Ve'yamar, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Melocho ha'aretz kevodo, Az bechorash gadol, Adir v'chazak mashmim kol, V'naseim le'matzeh Baruch Yomeru, Baruch Kevod Adonai, Mimkomo, Mimkomcha Malkeinu Tofia, V'timloch Aleinu, Ki Mechakim Anachnu Lach, Matai Timloch B'Tzion, V'karov B'Yameinu Le'olam Va'ed Tishkon, Tishkadav V'Tishkadash B'toch Yerushalayim Ircha, L'dor V'dor, U'lenetzach Netzachim, Ve'eneinu Tirena, Malchutecha, Hadavar Ha'amor B'Shirei Uzecha, Ayadei David Meshiach Tzidkecha, Yimloch Adonai Le'olam, Elohai Tzion, L'dor V'dor, Hallelujah. L'dor V'dor Nagid Godlecha, U'lenitzach Nitzachim Kedushacha Nakdish, V'shichacha Eloheinu Mipinu Yamush Le'olam Va'ed, Kel Melech Gadol V'kadosh Ata, Baruch Ata Adonai Ha'el HaKadosh. We'll continue individually using either, as always, the words on the page or the words on your heart this Shabbat. We will meet again on page 120 or 364. Shalom b'mroma, Ya'aseh shalom aleinu, Le'avo Yisrael, Le'imru, amen. Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu, Le'avo Yisrael, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, amen. May the one who brings peace to God's universe bring peace to us all, to all people Israel and all inhabitants of earth. Okay. So we will close this section of the service with Kaddish Shalem on page 138 or 392. Yikadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah Ve'alma Divra Hiruteh Ve'amlik Machuteh V'chayechon V'yamechon V'chayedachol Beit Yisrael B'galah U'bizman Kari V'imeru Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevorach Le'alam U'al Ne'almaya Yisbarach Yisbarach V'shabach Yisbar V'shamad V'naseh V'kadar V'talev V'talav Shmei D'Kudashah Recha Le'elam Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tisachata V'nechamata Damiran Be'alma V'imeru Amen Yisavach Lon Chon V'adchon D'chol Yisrael Kodem Avuhon Divishma V'imeru Amen Yesh Lamar Amin Shemayim V'chayim Aleinu V'chol Yisrael V'imeru Amen Oseh Shalom B'mramav V'yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imeru Amen. So this brings us into our Torah study section. We begin that with prayers for healing with our Mishabera. So I will, begin the prayer and share the names of those who we are praying for healing in body and in spirit as a community. And then I will invite you to share the names of anybody who you're also praying for, whose name is on your heart this Shabbat. You want to follow along. We are on page 144 of the new Siddur. Mishabera Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak VeYaakov VeImotenu Sarah Rivka Rachel VeLeah. May God, who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, bring blessing and healing to all who are ill within our congregational family and beyond. As a community this week, we are praying for healing of Marcia Bornstein, Joy Kraus, Sarah Badbrina, Joseph Pelletier, Miles Berube, Renee Armstrong, Joe Moret, Deborah Guggenheimer, Esther Badlaba Vitalba, Naftali Ben Hana, Jamie Loud, Richard Handberger, Ruth Klein, Esther Batia Bat Yehudit, Marcia Rosman, Donald Klein, Irit Bat Binyamin Bashirli, Fred Pack, Susan Handberger, Max Lager, Haya Bat Necha, Ruchel Bat Gittel Yisrael Nahum, Esther Riva Bat Shor Pesha, Betsy Powers, Katie Shander, Yemiyahu Ben Sarah Lieben, Elliot Solomon, and Barbara Fritz Warby. Is there anybody's name you'd like to add to our prayers for healing this morning? Marianne, please.
Francis Yvonne, Steve Dicklin, and I would
Thank you. Renee, please. Thank you. David, please.
Ashley Wilkins, Paulo Norfolk, Sinclair Rivka, Lydia Bagito, and Dr. Mark Feldman.
Thank you. Steve, please.
Ben Gerson, Sonia Finkel, Bell Gill, Sis Dryos, and Rule.
Thank you. May the Holy One mercifully restore them to health and vigor, granting them physical and spiritual well-being. And although Shabbat is a time to refrain from petitions, we yet hope and pray that healing is at hand. And let us say, Amen, and a refuah shlema to all. The hope, of course, is that our Torah learning only brings healing. That part of what we're doing, part of the holiness of studying Torah, is that it brings healing to others and to the world. Let's hold that in mind as we learn today. So I'm going to go ahead and say the blessing over studying Torah. I'm going to then hand out some sheets for us to look at a certain part of the Torah portion with afterwards. So we find that prayer on page 63 or page 7. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. May the words of Torah, Adonai, our God, be sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of all your people, so that we, our children, and all the children of the house of Israel may come to love you and to study your Torah on its own merit. Praised are you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to God's people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bacharbanu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So if I could ask somebody to, if they're willing to hand out these sheets, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Marianne. Well, having this lavalier is very helpful. I can move and still be heard. I get it. Thank you. So this week's Torah portion, chock full of interesting things. Really interesting, some very challenging things, some very meaningful things. What I want to focus on this morning is a very interesting aspect of the Torah portion that also appears elsewhere, and it is the experience and the laws surrounding our treatment of the orphan, widow, and stranger. Now, these three people, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, are three categories of people in the biblical consciousness who deserve particular attention and care in our society. We see this all over the Torah, these three categories of people in particular. So today what we're going to do, we're going to explore these categories of orphan, widow, and stranger. We're going to think about it as it's sort of manifesting in this week's Torah portion, and then talk about the way that these categories of people sort of appear in our own reality, in our own time. And we'll bring what the Torah has to teach us about treating the orphan, the widow, and the stranger to us for our time. So we're going to start right in the Torah portion itself in the book of Deuteronomy. Perhaps because I'm the one with the microphone and there are people on stream, I'll go ahead and read the Torah text aloud. Okay, here we are. So we're in Deuteronomy 24:17-22. You shall not subvert the rights of the stranger or the orphan. You shall not take a widow's garment as a pledge for a loan. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat down the fruit of your olive trees, do not go over them again. That shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not pick it over again. That shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Always remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. Okay. So I would say that we're roughly, one second, Michael, we roughly have two commandments here. We could categorize the commandments in two kind of buckets. So what are these two commandments? How would you describe the two commandments with regards to the orphan, the widow, and the stranger? Michael, do you have a response to that, or do you have a clarifying question?
No, I wanted to point out we could use that standing line for people in congregations if you wish.
I'm happy to just repeat back what people say as I've been doing, so there's less like shuffling around. But thank you for the thought. Okay, so I see Charlie and then Marianne.
So, number one, we're just not ever supposed to forget that we were slaves.
Okay.
Number two, we categorize people that should be alone, and we are responsible for looking after them.
Great. So let's not yet get to that level of interpretation. Before we get there, let's just name what the commandments themselves are. So, Marianne, please.
That's what I see as the commandments part, verse 17, you shall not subvert the rights of the stranger or take a widow's garment, which is by effect of chapter neighbor.
Great.
And then verse 18, remember that you were a slave in Egypt. God constantly sort of commands us to remember that. And that the Lord leads you.
Okay,
And you
yeah.
go on, and well, maybe that's not the commandment, maybe that's just a reminder that to observe the first commandment.
Okay, great. So we're seeing at least one command, like we've described at least one of the commandments here. One of the commandments is that there's a kind of economic commandment being made. You shall not take a widow's garment as a pledge for a loan. We can talk about what's behind that in a moment. And that's sort of couched in this sense that you shall not subvert the rights of the stranger or the orphan. That is commandment number 1. Then we have the commandments, the agricultural commandments. Marcia, do you want to talk about those?
So in both 19, 20, and 21, they're all kind of the same. It's like you go and you do something once, and whatever is left, you must do.
Exactly. So 3 different versions of the commandments that describe that you go out into your field, you go and pick grapes, you go and gather olives, and you don't go back for anything you've forgotten. Those things belong to the widow, the stranger, and the orphan. So those are the 2 major commandments that we're describing. We can talk a little bit later about what the reminder to remember that we were slaves in Egypt is about, what it's doing here. We'll come back to that. It's very interesting, I think. So these are our 2 commandments. In what ways do you think these 2 commandments ensure the protection for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger? What is it about these commandments that are particularly caring or considerate? Yeah, Gary.
It's a reminder that the property is there, that we need to share that property.
Excellent. So Gary's saying the commandment is a reminder that the property also, that a certain part of the property belongs to the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, if I'm understanding you correctly, Gary. And so the commandment in a way is saying, it's not saying, oh, I'm giving you charity. It's saying you have a stake in this property, and what that looks like is everything that I've left behind because I've forgotten it. So very interesting. Thank you. So those are really different mindsets, right, to how we think about treating the stranger, orphan, and widow versus it is yours versus it's mine and I'm going to give you some of it. So really interesting. Steve.
In today's context, it would be simply to take the building.
Say more.
It's up to all of us. I'm not sure all of us.
Great. So what these commandments are articulating is a shared responsibility among everybody in society to care for the widow, orphan, and stranger. I'm not going to define that yet because we're going to define it together, what that actually means. So part of what the commandments are doing are ensuring that everybody takes responsibility for one another. Wonderful. What else are these commandments doing that are sort of protecting these 3 groups of people? David.
The extension of what we just said, it does not really belong to any individual. This is something that God is given from God, and God wants it to those who have it. It's not something that is my grace. This is your own. This is something that's it's not coming from us, it's coming from God.
Okay, great. So David's articulating this idea that these commandments help us sort of reframe how we see what we own as not really ours, but really belonging to God. How does that help the widow, orphan, and the stranger, David? Take it one step further.
What is society is set up? Society is set up in different strata. You have the Ashirim, and you have the Aniim.
Which means the wealthy and the poor. Great.
And it's something that the rich have to give to the poor, and the poor have to, even the poor have to give to the poorer one. And it's something that's kind of, it's almost like an artificial way that society is structured. The rich, the poor, the people in the middle, and it's something that everybody is equal from God.
Great. So these commandments are like a grand equalizer. They're ultimately saying, don't forget that, you think that, oh, I'm wealthier, I have more, I'm less wealthy, I have less. But in the grand scheme of things, God owns it all. And under God, we're all sort of equal in that way, as God is the owner. So really important. Thank you so much. Marcia, Marianne.
So instead of looking at it from the perspective of the rich person who owns the feel like we need to leave it because it's really not yours. This is also an equalizer for the orphans, the widow, the stranger. They're not, it's theirs. They don't have to feel like, oh, I'm just getting what's left over. This is my thing.
Great. So it really goes against this idea that you are marginalized, you get the scraps. What Marcia is saying is what this commandment does is actually give people who, I'm going to say, who are sort of in a lower strata in society, but we're going to get much more specific in the definition, ownership over something and access to something that's theirs. This is a hugely empowering experience. Thank you. Yeah, Marianne.
So I'm going to be the, I don't know what the right word
Do it. Shatter all of our idealism and all of the. Do it.
The way you guys have been talking about.
Go ahead.
Because I think it's quite clear, at least in the verses of Deuteronomy, that God is recognizing that some people own the land, your vineyards, your fields, whatever, but leave the rest. But in order to take care of the poor or the widow, the stranger, whatever, don't go back and take more, just leave it for them. I don't see an implication that it belongs to them. I think there's pretty clear ownership here, but we have an obligation to take care of these people who may not be owners.
Right.
And that's good. I mean, I think that's all good. But I don't see the sort of equalization that you're talking. I don't think this is a great kibbutz in the sky.
Love that.
I think this is a little more capitalistic than we're willing to admit to.
Okay,
And it does
yeah.
provide, it is saying you have to provide for, and you have to recognize that these people have rights, that they're people too.
Yeah. Okay, this is really important. What Marianne is saying is more or less, and tell me if I'm right, where does it say that this actually belongs to God and doesn't actually belong to the people there? And I'll answer this by saying it says that actually elsewhere in the Torah, and maybe people have seen it elsewhere in the Torah, and we did that thing unconsciously where we said, oh, it says it over there in the Torah, so it must mean the same thing here, which is a totally fine thing to do. Actually, that's one way to study Torah with integrity. But I think there is one way to look at it, Marianne, which is what you're saying, which is either this is describing a kind of grand equalizing reality, or it's describing a kind of benevolent capitalist model, which says certain people own the land, and guess what? You have to give some of it away to people who don't own. That may be the model that this is actually describing. So maybe if Stephen and David on this, and then I'm going to ask a different question.
I was just going to take it your answer and go through it.
Do it.
Because if you look within the text in 3 places, it shows ownership. If you are field, you are vineyard, and your olive trees. It doesn't say it's not field.
It doesn't say my field, capital M either. So I think Steve is making a good close reading. It doesn't say, even in the grammar, it says your field owner, your grapes owner. Fair enough.
Does the Hebrew use the same words?
Yes. Yes. David.
Earlier, not in this portion, but earlier, we talked about the Shemitah year.
Yes.
Year that even terms of specifically the land.
Yes.
The land that's where it's ultimately God, and every 7th year you have to keep it balanced.
Yes.
And that's also something that the choice of this isn't really your land for perpetuity. Also, in terms of something's poor, they've always attached to something. The Jubilee year, the slaves go free.
Yes.
Nobody, in 7 years, you go free. So it's something that, this is kind of more of an equalization of the resources. even so much so that it's under the slave, and they don't want to become free, they have to voluntarily say, I want to remain a slave.
Yes.
And they kind of sign it in their hearing or whatever they put in there, that to get this person voluntarily being a slave. So there's no, in terms of that, there's a little bit of a shift in terms of status of people. Somebody
Right.
is a slave, becomes a free person.
Yes, so,
And the land itself, which human beings are using,
Yes.
it also becomes free. You can't take all the nitrogen and all the good stuff out of the earth because it's not yours.
yes, okay. So David is sort of expanding on the point I made earlier, which is that in another part of the Torah, it describes that our relationship to the land is not as the owners, that God is the owners, even though it doesn't say that specifically here. David is describing two phenomenon where we see that specifically, and this is going to be really, really relevant this coming year because we are in what's called the Shemitah year starting this year. I'm going to talk about it more at Rosh Hashanah. Shemitah year. It's the 7th year of a 7-year agricultural cycle, by which in the 7th year you let land lie fallow and you let debts go free. Seven versions of that, so 7 times 7. When you get to the 50th year of that, it's called the Yovel, the Jubilee year. It does something even more radical. All land reverts to their original owners and all slaves are freed. It's a very interesting thing. I'll talk about Yovel also on Rosh Hashanah. So these are two models that again are saying, like, don't get too high-minded, the land isn't really yours. Again, I think Marianne makes an important point that it's, the Torah is, we know that it's not of one mind about many things, including how to relate to what you own. In some ways, it's describing here what you own. It's mine. I share some of it with someone else. There's another biblical model which says, we don't really own any of it. So this is important. Renee, and then we're going to move to another question. You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but what I can say is that in Israel, the laws of the 7-year agricultural cycle laws still exist, as do sort of tithing laws and things like this. So if you're somebody who keeps kosher, you go to the store, you go to the market, you have to look for a certificate that says this is tithed produce, this produce follows the laws of the sabbatical year, etc. So it's very interesting. It's like, look, if you care about that, you look out for that certificate. David, I'd like to move on. I'm sorry. I'd like to move on to the next question. So I want to get back a little bit to the orphan, the widow, and the stranger paradigms here, which I think are very important. So what do you think these 3 groups of people have in common that we are urged as a group to treat them with particular care and concern? Gary and then Marianne.
Well, I think it goes back to the property ownership on there. In that time period, it was a male head of household that owned the property. The widow, which didn't own that property anymore. The orphan obviously didn't have the stranger, was from outside the property.
Great. So Gary is pointing out something important, which is to say that these 3 groups of people do not own property in and of themselves. I think there's 2 questions that emerge from that. One is, what's the problem with that in the biblical context? What does that mean for your life? And the other, and this is perhaps my own question, is that no woman owned property. Should women have been in the same category? My own question. So we'll hold those questions. Marianne, I know you wanted to contribute.
Part of my thinking relates to what you were questioning, and that is each of these 3 groups, in terms of that society and in terms of others, was without political power.
Okay.
And what God is saying here, and it's the first commandment in this section, is they still have rights. They're still people. You cannot take advantage of them. And I think that that's kind of what, although to come back to the other thing that you said about women, there was that section, I forget now which part of that is, but where the daughters.
Yes, the daughters of Slofachad wanting to be part of the inheritance.
They
Yes.
should be able to inherit the land. So while that certainly was not common practice, and most widows might be poor or without, but they were without power, then this is really, I think, what God's trying to say here. God should protect people. People without power still have rights.
Great.
We have to protect them.
Great. So what you're saying, Marianne, is not owning property means you don't have power in society. Either property ownership gave you power, or it's indicative of the fact that you are powerful. And not having it, but the Torah says just because you don't have that power, it doesn't mean you don't have rights. So you still have to be treated according to sort of human dignity and human rights. So wonderful. Anyone want to add, like, what do you think these three groups have in common? David, and then Charlie. I'd really love to stick with what we're doing, David. Oh, women's, okay, go ahead.
Women's rights.
Yes.
Before she's married, she has no rights. The only right she has is to her father.
Yes.
Once she's married, she has no rights. The only right she has is to her husband.
Yes.
And even in slow time, they inherit, but they have to marry somebody from the same tribe. And the one who really has true ownership is I think they'll come to your friend, I'm not sure, whatever it was the husband. In terms of the covenant, not all of these, it's everything, both the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. It comes down to a kind of sociology kind of a problem, right? Or an economic problem, that basically the women have no rights, and the ladies certainly have no rights because they don't believe the same God as we do. The orphan also has no rights because he owns nothing and therefore he's worth nothing. So it's something that it's kind of the people that are excluded from really participating fully in society.
Okay, great. So David sort of explained the different rules of women not having ownership, sort of autonomy and ownership. So thank you, and sort of affirming what other people said in terms of commonalities. So wonderful. Charlie, and then I want to look at one of the other texts on the page to add to this conversation.
It's interesting, I look at these three groups as people who have to care for because they don't have things and that they may not have people who care about them. But Marianne brought up a point that I had not thought about in relation to power. So I have to agree with that, but I just look at these three groups as just all of them to be considered almost orphans, no one to care for them.
Okay.
It's our responsibility.
Okay, interesting. So this is sort of in the realm also of kind of being excluded, as David said. These are people who are more likely to be alone. If you're an orphan, you're more likely to be alone. If you're a stranger, because of you not being part of the dominant culture and society, you're more likely to be alone. Same with the widow. So this one way to understand this category is people who are more likely to be alone. I want to add the voice of the medieval commentator Sforno in here, who I think has a very interesting take on this as well. He says as follows: "You shall not subvert the rights of the stranger or the orphan during strife. Be particularly on guard not to be unfair to orphans or strangers who may be reluctant to speak up on their own behalf so as not to make waves. You should go out of your way to argue on their behalf so as to compensate for their feelings of insecurity in facing adversaries." What do you think he's saying about what is sort of common among these three people? What it's like to be them? David, yeah.
It's almost easy to say, but it's something that this is kind of in fairly modern times, we talk about it differently. Subvert the rights of strangers during strife. Germany was going through a major depression. It's certainly not my fault. I'm a Starker Deutscher. it has to be these Jewish people that are doing it. It has to be somebody's fault. And the one whose fault it is strangers. Someone who doesn't believe in the same God that I do. Someone who doesn't follow the same practices that I do. So it's not only am I going to exclude them, but I'm going to make them as kind of the people, or make them it's their fault.
Okay, so one response is that Forno is talking about them being most likely to be blamed for the problems of society. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry?
This has happened quite a bit as well.
Spain?
You talk about the Inquisition.
Okay. I think he's Italian. Yeah, Ibn Ezra is Spanish and Forno is Italian.
Somebody's not to mention already. But it's something also happens in the state too. When there's a problem, the Jews of the fault, send them out, they can kill them or get them out.
Sure. This has certainly been our experience historically of being scapegoated, for sure.
Bring some Armenians. It was the same kind of thing. Well, it's something we're having. This society isn't like it used to be. It's the Armenians' fault. Or it's in Africa. It's kind of people, there's a tendency to say, look, I'm good, it's not my fault, it's their fault.
Great. So right, these three groups, the widow, orphan, and stranger, are most likely to be blamed and exploited because of the problems of the larger society. Right. So right, and that's why the Torah is coming in and saying, don't do that. Don't do that. Steve, and then Charlie, and then we're going to move to another question.
But these three groups are afraid to speak up because they're powerless. And they're powerless because they don't own anything. It's society that made them that way.
Great. So what do you do with that, Steve?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the take, I'm going to take it away. But don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. So there's still some, they still might feel submissive to the haves versus the have-nots.
So you're saying, this is very interesting, you're saying, well, it's nice that these marginalized groups in society are given more rights and are maybe given charity and are maybe thought about, but fundamentally their place is, they stay in their place.
So we take the widow.
Okay.
She died, and the spouse died, and if it wasn't in the family, the widow couldn't inherit.
I think you're asking a very interesting question, Steve, which is why is the answer to not give these groups their own access to land, property ownership, or inheritance? It's a really good question. Do we think the Torah is going far enough? Do we think the Torah, or are we happy with what the Torah is doing? I think you're bringing up a very important point, so thank you. Charlie, and then I want to ask a different question.
I just have one question.
Yeah.
Unless I'm reading it wrong, we're going to address the widow.
Well, sure. I think I should have put an ellipses in there. It's really that whole verse, which also, it was the whole verse. Yes.
I was just curious because it was like, why did you leave women out? That's what it was.
The widows? Yeah.
Okay.
It's in there. Yeah. It's meant to be in there. My apologies for not putting the ellipses. I'll just draw one other thing out of this Forno text, which is, I think this is actually really describing the sort of psychological experience of being somebody who is a stranger, an orphan, or a widow, which is to say that you feel very beaten down. One might be because life has handed you a deck of cards that hasn't been so great. And to be somebody who deals with that is very difficult. You know, in our own world, we have seen that people whose spouses have passed away. It's difficult, and we've seen that, and we've experienced that, or we have been sort of friends to people who have experienced that, and it's not easy. We've seen that. But then again, to at the same time be in a position in a society where you're constantly powerless is a very difficult sort of psychological experience as well. So I think it's describing here that all of these groups of people have endured the psychological consequences of powerlessness or poverty. Let me bring it to today. Who are the widows, orphans, and strangers in our society today?
Refugees all over the world.
Okay. One answer, refugees all over the world. Tell me why you put them in in this category of stranger, orphan, widow.
They're the ones that jump to the forefront of every absolute.
Okay. Great.
No food, no food.
Being a refugee is one of the most insecure statuses to have in the world. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Marianne, did you?
Well, I think refugees are top of mind right now.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. In addition, we talk about other marginalized groups. We have, certainly in addition to the refugees, we have in this country the whole issue of the dreamers, of the undocumented who've grown up here, for whom they should be home, but they're still without the power structure, the support that we think that many people think they should have. And other people, whether the rural poor, the urban poor, who are marginalized, whose educational services may not be, whose health services may not be as good as those of us who are in more fortunate circumstances. And so those may be, some of them may be widows and orphans, but, but they may not necessarily be widows or orphans. They could have whole families and still be in marginalized circumstances.
In the sense that our society is not set up to be hospitable to certain groups of people. I think we can have a long conversation about immigration. I imagine there's a diversity of opinions in our congregation about how we feel about documented, undocumented dream. Like, it's deeply complicated, and I think our values can point us in a lot of different directions. But to notice what is troubling to us about the experience of immigrants, documented and undocumented in this country, is something that our Torah portion can help us sort of point to. And certainly those who are sort of made poor by sort of lack of sort of infrastructure to sort of like really.
The whole pandemic thing,
right.
And the ability to get vaccinations out to people in certain communities, regardless of whether they want it or not, the infrastructure hasn't been there for many people. And then get compounded by the people who are opposed to it. That's a separate issue.
Right.
The issue of the infrastructure is, sort of related to this, to get less of.
Right. So maybe we would describe it as people who've been made disadvantaged in the society. Who else would you categorize under those, under these three categories? Michael, did you have your hand up, or?
I'm reserving because I want to say that it's very, very difficult.
It's fine. That's okay.
I don't want to. But I didn't want to interrupt. I'm trying to bide my time. I am captivated by reading the original portion, the original section. This notion of reaping and going through and believing and so on. And for some bizarre reason, if you all know me well enough to know that's not a start. I was thinking about God going through the vineyard, if you will, and populating it with 613 folks. And I think I know the answer to the question. But it occurred to me that if you put those 613 commandments together as a nation, there got to be loopholes. There got to be places where God's commandment didn't define what a Jew must do.
Okay, very good.
I'm assuming, I'm going to leave forward to this second and still take a make a bet here, but I'm going to filling in the loopholes for testifying for being a Jew. But that's fun.
Well, you're not wrong to say that's an entirely different direction. But
Now we know you're here.
well, maybe let me respond to that quickly, and then we'll close. Okay, the idea that there are kind of cracks in the system, that the biblical legal system does not account for all scenarios or all issues. That is true. That is one of the things that drives the project of Rabbinic Judaism. More specifically, though, it's that as the world around us changed, the question of how to apply biblical law and principles becomes less and less obvious. So fundamentally, like all of the legal text in Judaism, is based in biblical law. You never find, I'm not going to say never, the commitment that Jewish legal scholars make is to ground whatever they're saying in biblical principle and law. People have all kinds of ways of stretching that. That's a different conversation for a different time. But the rabbinic legal process is about saying, in these new scenarios never imagined by the Torah, like electricity, like a self-driving car, like Jewish people and non-Jewish people getting married, like never imagined by the Torah. We have to figure that out. So that sort of leads to this very fascinating and meaningful, at least for some, process of evolving Jewish law. The other thing I'll say, Michael, you did a thing that people have been doing for centuries, which is writing a midrash, writing a sort of imaginative narrative about what might have been happening in that moment. So keep it up. It's very, no, I'm serious though. It's a very meaningful way to engage with text. Okay. So just by way of closing, I'd love to hear what you're taking away. What is one thing you're taking away about what it might look like to sort of live into these sort of commandments and principles in the Torah, in how we treat the category of the widow, orphan, and stranger in our society today? What is the Torah teaching you? David.
I think we have to redefine the principles. You know, how to your neighbor, or has to be redefined as the widow, the orphan, the stranger, as well as somebody that belongs to somebody. I think about disenfranchised people in a way. I think of abused women, I think of abused children, and the only protection is abused women as before was the husband. And the husband is certainly ever doing the responsibility of that. Society has to get there and to do something with that. You know, and again, basically, I think that you are repetitive and certainly I'm sure people will tell us in the out area, you have to really love my neighbor as myself, and you have to redefine who the neighbor is. The neighbor is not someone who's exactly like you. The neighbor can be somebody who has a totally different ideology, totally different skin color, totally different values, but they all have the same values to God.
Great. So you're actually taking this one step further than the Torah in this particular passage is saying. What you're saying is that you take away from this, not only treat orphans, strangers, and widows in a certain way, but love them. So really beautiful. Love it. Anyone else want to share a takeaway? Charlie, is that a hand or is that a...
Okay. Just remember that what you have today, you might not have tomorrow.
And therefore...
Be kind to everybody.
Great.
Don't just think about yourself.
Great. Don't think about yourself. Be kind to others. Recognize the kind of cyclical nature of what we have and do not. Maybe one last. Yeah, Marianne.
Yeah, I'm still attracted, as I was from the beginning, to this idea of not subverting the rights of people. And I think we have lots of ways to deal with that in today's society, for sure. In this country and other countries throughout the world. And then to me that's different. The idea of loving the poor, that I'm not, that doesn't agree with me. But the idea that whoever you are, you have rights. That is important, and we need to respect. We need to treat people with respect.
Great. So the takeaway for you is the affirmation that all people have rights and that we should not subvert them. Great. Thank you very much. As always, very interesting conversation, very important. So, as usual, apropos of this conversation, we are going to continue with the prayer for our country. We are going to do the one-off book, which I have here. Yes, it's me. Okay. God, who watches over all creation, give wisdom to those who are leaders among us. Inspire with creativity those who legislate. Provide compassion to those who make decisions affecting our lives. Educate them in the ways of justice that are the vision of the Hebrew prophets. May they never be far from mercy and understanding, fairness and equity. We ask for cooperation between people of different races and religions, and understanding between those of different abilities, gender identities, and sexual orientations. Restore love to families who are separated for whatever reason. May we have the courage to speak out against bigotry at all times, against hatred that is racial, religious, or sexual. May the young profit from the experience of their elders and also share with them the idealism of their youth. May we all work towards a common goal, the improvement of humanity. God, who created our beautiful and beloved country, preserve its beauty. Protect your creations from selfishness, abuse, and destruction. Provide wisdom to all who dwell here and teach us to be strong. Give us the ability to work with other nations for a better world and maintain good lives in harmony and in love with wise leadership that fosters cooperation rather than war. Protect us with Sukkot Shlomecha, your shield of peace, and let us say, Amen. We continue with the prayer for the state of Israel, which we find on page 149 or 417. Avinu Shebashamayim, rock and redeemer of the people Israel, bless the state of Israel with its promise of redemption. Shield it with your love, spread over it the shelter of your peace. Guide its leaders and advisors with your light and your truth. Help them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those who defend our holy land. Deliver them, crown their efforts with triumph. Bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. And let us say, Amen. We close our Torah study with the words Eitz Chaim Hi, with affirming the life-giving and grounding power that Torah has in our lives. We're on the bottom of 154 or 426. Eitz Chaim Hi, Lama Hazikim Ba, V'Tov Me'ushar, Teracheh Darchei Noam, V'chol Netivoteh Shalom, Hashirenu Adonai, Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh Yameinu, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. This brings us to our Musaf service, which we find on page 155 or 428. I'll invite Charlie up to join me in leading. And we'll start with the Chatzi Kaddish, and we will keep Marcia in mind as our 10th. We're on page 155 or 428. I'll invite you to rise in body or in spirit.
Yikada v'yikada shemei rabba, v'yama divra kirute, v'yamlich malchute, v'chayekonu v'yomechon, v'chayedecha beit Yisrael. Bagala, bagala, u'bizman Yeshmei Rabba Mavorach Le'olam Olam Me'amaya Yiparach Yiparach V'yishtabach V'yipar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalaho Shemir Kedusha Baruchu Leila Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechamata Ramiram De'alma V'maru Amen.
We'll continue with the Musaf Amidah, which we will say individually. I invite you, as always, to use the words on your heart or the words on the page this morning. We are on page 156b or 430. We meet again on 181 or 506. We'll continue with Kaddish Shalem on page 181 or 506.
Yikadav Yikadashem Me Rabba V'yamad Yivra Kirute V'yamlich Machute V'chayechonav Yomechonu Chayedecha Beit Yisrael V'agalav V'zman Kari V'yimeru Amen Yehesh Me Rabba Mavarach Li'olam Olam Me'amaya Yivarach Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalash me'de kudusha baruchu le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata ta'amiram b'yama v'yimeru amen tikabal salotonu va'uton d'chol Yisrael kadam avuhon divi shemaya v'yimeru amen yehesh lama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'yalka Yisrael v'yimeru Amen. Oh, say shalom b'mamav. Oh, yeah, say shalom. Aleinu v'yalka Yisrael v'yimeru. Amen.
We continue continue on page 182 or page 508 with Ein Keloheinu.
Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Mi Eloheinu, Mi Kadonenu, Mi Kemalkeinu, Mi Kemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Shektiru, Avotenu, Levanecha Ektorah Hasamim.
I invite everyone to rise in body or in spirit for the Aleinu on page 183 or 510.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, l'tegedu l'lioseh breshit, shelo asanu k'goyei harasot, v'lo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, v'goralenu k'chol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, Umishachavim umodim Lifnei Melech Malchei Hamlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shehu Nateh Shamayim Ve'yosei Haaretz Umoshav Yekaro B'Shamayim Imo Ushchinatu Zo V'gavei Meromim Eloheinu Enon Emet Malkeinu Efesilato Kakatu B'Torato V'yadata Hayom V'hashevota Elabavecha Ki Adonai Hu Elohim Ba Shamayim Nimal V'yal Haaretz Kakatu b'Toratecha Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed v'nemar v'haya Adonai l'melech ha'kol haaretz v'yom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo
We will continue with the final Mornis Kaddish of our service, which we find on page 184 or page 512. I invite you to remain standing in body or in spirit if you're in mourning or commemorating a Yortzeit this Shabbat. As a community, we are commemorating the Yortzeits this week of Samuel Blacker, grandfather of Steve Krause, Eleanor Spitzer, sister of Steve Krause, Howard Slater, father of Bonnie Slater Damont, and Brenda Novick, mother of Seth Novick. Yitgadal ve'yikadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divra kirutei ve'amlich malchutei, ve'chayechon u'yomechon u'chayei v'chol beit Yisrael, v'agala u'vizman karim v'yimru amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam l'amei omaya, Yitbarach, V'yishabach, V'yitpa'ar, V'yitromam, V'yitnaseh, V'yitadar, V'yitaleh, V'yitalel, Shmei Dekucha, Brichu, La'ela Mincho, Birchata, V'shirata, Tushbechata, V'nechemata, Damiran, Ve'alma, V'yimru, Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chaim Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimramav, Hu Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'imru Amen. You may be seated. We're going to go ahead and shift gears and share with one another things that we would like to say Shehechianu for. Anything sort of good from this past week, anything you're looking forward to, anything you're generally grateful for. So, Marianne, please kick us off.
We had an opportunity this week to have 2 lunches with friends we haven't seen in person for a very, very long time. Monday we had friends who actually live in Salem, but for pandemic reasons, we've only seen them via Zoom. And then friends from California yesterday. So we had a wonderful time with both couples.
Excellent. Wonderful. Others?
Well,
Marcia?
I guess I think it's good news. I actually got approval now that I am now going to be increasing to full-time 40-hour position.
Excellent. Wonderful. Wonderful. Good. Others? Right. Anyone else want to share? Yeah, Charlie.
My great niece's 6th birthday.
Very sweet. Very sweet. Wonderful. Seeing friends, well-deserved promotion, 6th birthday. Wonderful array of things. Go ahead and say the Shehechianu together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Amen. Amen. All right, I'm going to invite up our board rep for some announcements.
Hi, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Those are in person, those on stream. I think most of you know me. I'm Charlie Bernstein, the head of ritual. Thank you to Rabbi Mimi for leading us in prayer this morning, and Mr. DeSatnik as well, and Michael and Marianne, who did their debut today in person of Baruch She'amar. Monday at 7:30 p.m. there is a programming committee meeting. Tuesday at 10 a.m. Tots story time at TBT. Next Friday evening, Shabbat services begin at 7:30 in person at TBT. Next Saturday, Shabbat services begin at 10 a.m. on Zoom. But at 8 p.m. that evening, I hope that you'll all join us on Zoom as we join with Temple Eitz Chaim for a Salichot program and service. Next Sunday, between 2 and 4, we are having a welcome back ice cream truck at TBT. Bring friends and prospective members. Ice cream costs will be sponsored by the temple. Save the date, starting September 1st. The first Friday of every month will be on Zoom, the first Friday Shabbat service. The rest of our Friday and Saturday services will be held in person. The high holidays are coming soon, very soon. Please check the weekly high holiday emails and the website for information about services and other special programs, and make sure that you register, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's go ahead and begin our conclusion with Adon Olam. We are on 187 or 514.
Adon Olam Asher Malach B'Terem Kol Yisir Nivra Le'enasa B'Chesed Kol Azan Nikra, Azamelech Shemo Nikra, Ve'acharei Kichot HaKol Levado, Yimlok Nora, Ve'hu Haya, Ve'hu Hoveh, Ve'hu Yiyeh B'tifara, Ve'hu Yiyeh B'tifara, Ve'hu Echad V'yein Sheni L'ham Shilo, L'hakbira, Ve'lireishi, Ve'litachlit, Ve'lo ha'oz, V'ha'misra, Ve'lo ha'oz, V'ha'misra, Ve'hu Eli, V'chai Go'ali, V'sur Kevli, V'yetzara, Ve'hu Nisi, Umanosli, Menakosi, V'yomekra, Menakosi, V'yomekra, V'yado, Avkid Ruchi, V'etishan, V'ayimra, V'imruchi, Gevirati, Adonai li, V'lo ira, Adonai li, V'lo ira.
Yasher Koach, Charlie, thank you. Yasher Koach to Steve, Yasher Koach to Michael, who week after week makes sure that those who are not here are able to access our services, which is a huge blessing. So Michael, I should say that every week, and my apologies for not doing that every week. It's amazing. Okay, I'd love to invite you to join me in Kiddush and Hamotzi. We are on page 315 or 734, and I'll invite you to rise in body or in spirit. Shameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam v'ritolam. Shameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam v'ritolam. Israel, Oti leolam, Veshameru b'nei Israel et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam v'ritolam. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et ha-shamayim ve'et ha'aretz, Veshameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam v'ritolam. U'bayom hashvi'i Shabbat vayinafash, Shabbat vayinafash, Shabbat vayinafash, Veshameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam v'ritolam. Zachor et yom ha-Shabbat lekadsho, sheshet yamim tavod v'sizecho me'achtecha, v'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha, lo ta'asecho melacha, ata uvincha uvitecha avdecha v'amatcha v'imtecha v'gercha asher bisharecha, ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai t'shamayim v'et ha'aretz et hayam v'kol asher bam, v'yelach v'yom hashvi'i okay, nerach Adonai et yom ha-Shabbat v'yekadshehu, sabri, chaverai, baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, borei peri agafen. It's the best, the grape juice, the best. And we'll continue with Hamotzi. Okay. Birshut with all of your permission, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Shabbat shalom, everyone. Travis Gary. How you doing? Pretty good. I'm really crushed around my holidays, but like it's okay, you know.
Obviously.
Yeah, that's right. How's life at the hospital?
Busy.
Yeah.
On vacation this week.
Oh, you are?
We just went back.
Where were you?
You posted a few good pictures, those were nice.
We were in the Berkshire.
What did you do in the Berkshire?
Hung out, we went to Shakespeare.
Oh, you did?
We saw King Lear.
Oh, that's a
Which
good
is
one.
the longest.
It's a long one. It's a long one.
Yeah, it's good, but it's long. Yeah.
We went to Tanglewood, saw the music of